This is video number 2 on chapter 20, America as Hyperpower. So we left off last time looking at this definition of globalization. Those of you that had political theory with me remember this from one of our chapters in that course. So this is from a scholar named Manfred Steger, right? So you can see, as again, this is kind of complex concept here where so he calls it multi-dimensional set of social processes, right? So we're kind of looking at that integration versus fragmentation. Again, kind of bringing us closer together, things like technology and all, and then fragmentation, sort of those things splitting us apart, right? So intensify these exchanges. I mean, think about just how global things have become with trade and technology and all that. But at some point, it deepens these connections between the local and distant. So this is a definition of globalization that I think is very useful because, again, a lot of people kind of have an idea what that is, but might have a difficult time trying to define it. So thinking about that global versus local dynamic, you might have heard of this author, a guy by the name of Tom Friedman. So he wrote a book quite a while back called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. So again, if you think about which one's which, of course, the Lexus, again, pretty expensive brand of car would be seen as the global. So then the olive tree, again, would be more local, sort of what's important to people, close to home, and then also looking at sort of the global dynamic, right? So he's a New York Times columnist, and he's written a lot about this globalization stuff. A later book that he wrote is called The World is Flat, where he sort of talks about the idea of globalization, that somebody, say in India or sub-Saharan Africa or wherever it might be in the world, today if they have a decent computer and internet access, they can work with major corporations around the world. That things have changed so much from just a couple decades ago. So one thing we wanted to look at, sort of the end of the 1980s, the early part of the 1990s, again, that transition from George H.W. Bush to the Bill Clinton presidency, is people were kind of talking about, well, what did the future mean? So this slide's titled Democracy and what we call the End of History. So this is a title from an article, and then later it became a book from this guy, Francis Fukuyama, right? His book was called End of History and the Last Man. So he wasn't saying that history ended, of course. That's not what he means by that. But more the idea that if you think about the sort of idea of kind of ideology, or sort of what would the kind of governing principle of a country should be, is the idea that, well, at the end of the Cold War, we saw that democracy had kind of triumphed over whatever else there might have been. So, of course, the Soviet Union was mostly connected to communism, and then fascism, for example, we might associate with, say, Italy or Germany during World War II. So the idea is, well, if you had, communism versus democracy, and communism had kind of seen to be the lesser of the two, then the idea is, well, maybe this was kind of over at the end of history. So we said, that one of the key things about democracy is universal principles. So not exclusive stuff like religion, ethnicity. So again, we think about democracy in the world today can look very different depending on where you might be. Say, for example, the United States is a democracy, South Africa, Japan, Germany, and elsewhere. But how that actually works is very different. So if you remember, for American politics, all we're looking at here is that democracy just means that the people have the authority, right? That they have free elections, that they have a voice in their system, these kind of things. All right, so it also satisfies this need for recognition, So instead of having these kind of power struggles, wars, and all that, people are sort of involved in the society. Then he says conflicts again may persist, but this historical clash over ideologies, again, communism versus democracy, all that kind of stuff. He said, well, that's kind of over. So we'll kind of talk about this a little later as well, right? The idea of this democratic peace. So if you remember, those of you that had international politics, the international politics course, that ended with this, what we call the democratic peace theory. The idea that, at least in the past couple decades, and really going even farther back, that no two strong democracies have ever gone to war with one another. Also, people sometimes call it the Golden Arches theory, where the idea is, that countries that have McDonald's don't really go to war with one another. That if think about McDonald's, Starbucks, and other major corporations, they don't tend to set up shop in basket case countries, right, where there's violence and where there's anarchy in the society, all those kind of things. All right. So again, this is just an important concept from Fukuyama, right, the end of history. All right. So you might have heard of this guy as well. So Colin Powell, right? So he was previously what's called the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? So basically the head of the United States, so head 4-star general. This kind of seen as sort of the lead person for the different military branches. So he happened to be an Army general, and then later, of course, would become Secretary of State under the President George W. Bush. All right. So this is again, think about late 80s, early 90s. He came up with what he called the Powell Doctrine, or what at least was termed the Powell Doctrine. So these are some of the principles. So again, like thinking about, well, if the United States, if we're going to get involved in conflict, how should that relate to our foreign policy goals? Is it a good idea or not? So these are just some of the main things that he looked at, right? So have a vital national security interest. So again, see that word interest. So right there from the beginning, you can see, well, even if something might have been seen in our values, right? Like, one group of people being oppressed by another in a country, right? Bad stuff going on. His argument was, well, unless that somehow affects the national security of the United States, our interests, then we shouldn't get in there, right? Should be a clear and obtainable objective, right? So why we're there. Everybody should kind of know what the plan is, and then exit strategy be planned from the beginning. So you can already start to see why some people, again, if you think about these sort of things that he talked about back in the day. Again, this is over about 25 years ago. People sort of questioned what was going on with the most recent Iraq War. Was there a clear and attainable objective? Did we have a clear exit strategy from the beginning? These type of things. Right? Should have broad political support. So he said, something that just the Democrats think is a great idea, or just the Republicans, probably not something we should go forward with. All right. And then he also had this idea that the military should go with decisive and overwhelming force, right? Rapid result. Kind of the idea of like, go big or go home. Don't just be tepid about it. It's instead of just sending a few thousand troops and see what happens. Go in there overwhelming. As many troops as you can muster. Try to end that conflict as soon as possible. But then to sum it up, this isn't seen as such a hawkish kind of thing. Where he said, look, it really should only be used in force as a last resort, meaning that he did see that the importance of diplomacy, talks, negotiations, that type of thing. That really, particularly with getting our soldiers on the ground there, risking their lives, that should really be seen as a last resort. Now, a lot of this really isn't such new things, right? So we talk about just war principles that have been around, for about 1,000 years or so that contain a lot of these same ideas. All right, so again, the sort of last years of the George H.W. Bush administration. Remember, so he only did his one term, right? And then he got beat by Bill Clinton when he tried to run for re-election. So this is from your book. So Herring says that that while he was considered a nice guy and a good leader and all that, that Bush offered no concrete vision of our future international role. So you got the word containment here, right? So remember that had guided policymakers during the Cold War. That was no longer relevant. So he kind of said, well, if the Soviet Union's no longer there, we don't have to worry about containment or maybe even rollback. So what's next? Soviet threat's gone, then what are we going to do? But in some ways, the kind of importance of the Middle East ramps up during this time, and then of course he's in office during the collapse of the Soviet Union when it signs itself out of existence in late 1991. All right, so some other stuff going on at this time, right? So in '91 we had this Madrid conference over in Spain. So of course, this issue has been going on for decades, right? The Arab-Israeli issue or the Palestinian-Israeli issue, whichever way you really want to look at it. So they were invited to speak for themselves at this international forum. So again, they're not a state even today, right? They of course want to be, but that is still kind of in the works, and of course some people are still opposed to that. So the issue of Israeli settlements. So again, so part of the land that Israel captured in some of those different wars, right? Say like the 1967 war, 1973 war, some of these others. So now they control two areas where that's mostly Palestinian, right? One next to the Mediterranean Sea called the Gaza Strip, and the other is kind of more on the eastern side of Israel called the West Bank. So there's if you Google that quickly, you can kind of see those two different areas. But what they've been doing, and sometimes makes it difficult to speak about what they call a two-state solution, right? Where you would have Israel and then you would have a viable Palestinian state, as well as you can see, Israel has been building what we call settlements, building homes, building communities in these Palestinian areas. So kind of the idea is, well, the more that happens, then the likelihood that they would really be able to go to a two-state solution seems very unlikely, right? Because you think about, well, if you got a whole bunch of Israelis that have moved and settled in these what used to be Palestinian areas, then obviously you can see why it'd be difficult to go back from that. So then down south from here, right, in Haiti, so even today, right, this is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So, a lot of places in the Caribbean actually aren't doing too bad. They have good tourism industries, different crops and so forth. Of course, there are a lot of poor countries, but nowhere is as poor as Haiti by any means, right? So this guy, with great name, Jean Bertrand d'Aristide, right? So he's overthrown in '91, but the United States decides not to intervene at that time. Right, so again, George W. Bush, H.W. Bush is still in office. Says, well, militarily, that's not like they would present much of a challenge. But then, well, kind of the idea is if you come in there, how are you going to get out? So easy to take over, difficult to get out. So Bush decides, it's better to leave it alone. So then turning more to Europe, right? So we also see things heat up in the former Yugoslavia, right? So of course nowadays that's split up into the different constituent countries, say like Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia Herzegovina, and so forth, Kosovo, so forth, right? So when this starts to happen, again, these are it's pretty small area in Europe. And the United States, for example, sees it primarily as a European problem. We didn't really have so much of a dog in that fight, is what they said at that time. And we also saw it as, well, this should be something that Germany, France, Britain, others in other major states in Europe should be able to handle without United States involvement, right? So again, you think about the values and interest idea. While it somehow might have affected our values, the idea was that, as far as our interests, not so much. So what started to happen there, so there's a vocabulary term I want you to be aware of called ethnic cleansing. So you can see here this is the expulsion, imprisonment, or killing of an ethnic minority by a dominant majority to try to achieve what we call ethnic homogeneity, right? So basically the idea is like if you had Croats and Serbs living in a certain area, if the Serbs were trying to do ethnic cleansing, they would try to get rid of all the Croats in that area, either by getting expelling them from that area, getting them in prison, or even downright killing. Now that's important to note. So remember, something like genocide is just the mass murder, seeking the destruction of a particular group, right? So we think about genocide during the Rwanda issue, which we'll look at in a minute here. Ethnic cleansing doesn't necessarily involve killing, though. Again, it could just be so the idea is you're trying to cleanse your area of whoever you don't want, whatever that ethnic minority might be. So then there's another vocabulary term that we think about kind of fits into this time frame of when cable news, the satellite and stuff started to become a bigger deal. So the CNN effect, the idea that when people see live images, videos on TV, it sort of accelerates that decision-making demand to do something. So again, something that might have had more deliberation, as Secretary of State Baker said, you're in real-time mode. You don't have time to reflect so much. People see dying, people see hardship and turmoil on TV. They say, oh, we have to get involved now. We really have to do something about it. All right, so then we'll start just briefly on Clinton, and actually we'll go ahead and end here. So then we'll start up with video 3 on speaking about the transition from the Bush to Clinton presidencies.